The cattle market in Prairie Dawn stank of blood and fear on that August afternoon in 1854. Elise Moreau stood on the auction wagon with her bare feet burning against sun-scorched planks, feeling splinters drive into her soles with each small shift of weight. The pain was distant, unimportant. What mattered was the arithmetic of dying and the height of the wagon bed, the angle required to clear the rail, the probability that a hoof would strike her temple cleanly enough to end consciousness before the trampling began. She had made these calculations 3 times in the past hour. Around her, the market churned with controlled chaos. Drovers moved cattle through narrow chutes with switches and curses. A boy darted too close to a loading pen, and a steer's horn caught his shirt tail, dragging him against the rails until a hand yanked him back by the hair. Somewhere behind the freight office, a horse screamed, the high, terrible sound of an animal with a broken leg, waiting for mercy it would not receive. Dust hung in the air, like a pall turned golden by slanting sunlight. It coated Elise's throat, filled her lungs, settled into the creases of her rope-burned wrists. She did not wipe it away. Her hands hung at her sides, motionless, because any movement drew attention, and attention brought consequences. Aldrich Boone stood behind her, one meaty hand wrapped around her upper arm. His fingers dug into the bruise he had left there 2 days earlier, finding the edges of the old pain with the precision of long practice. He smelled of whiskey and tobacco and something sourer, the particular stench of a man whose body was beginning to rot from the inside while he still walked and breathed. Indenture contract. Aldrich called to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a livestock auctioneer. He held up a folded sheaf of papers, waved them overhead. Legal and binding. Woman here owes me passage from New Orleans, 2 years' room, and board clothing medical care when she took sick last winter. Total debt $372. He paused, let the numbers settle. Several men whistled low. That was more than a homesteader cleared in a good year. But here's the rub. Aldrich's grin showed yellowed teeth. She can't breed. 2 years I've had her done my conjugal duty regular as clockwork and nothing takes. Barren as a salt flat, so I'm offering her contract to whoever wants it, all that debt, all that obligation for $1 cash. Laughter rippled through the crowd, the kind of laughter that had edges. What makes you think she's the problem? Someone called. More laughter, harder this time. Aldrich's hand tightened on Elise's arm until she felt something grind in the joint. She did not make a sound. Making sounds only made things last longer. I got 3 sons from my first wife before the fever took her. Aldrich said, his voice flattening into something colder. All healthy, all living. Problem ain't with my seed. The crowd shifted, murmured. The mathematics of blame were simple in this territory. If a field would not grow crops, you did not question the seed. You plowed it under and moved on. Elise looked past the faces, past the wagons and livestock pens, toward the gap in the rails where a woman her size could fit if she moved fast enough. The cattle beyond were restless, confined, dangerous. Their hooves would be quick. That mattered. That was mercy. At the edge of the yard, half hidden in the shadow of a freight wagon stacked high with barrels, stood a man who did not belong to the crowd. He was Lakota. She could see that in the way he stood, in the careful stillness that white men never quite mastered, the awareness of being watched that became second nature. When you moved through spaces that considered your presence an intrusion. His eyes met hers across the dust and noise. For a moment, perhaps 3 heartbeats, they looked at each other with the recognition of 2 people who had both calculated the distance to oblivion and found it wanting. Then he moved. Not quickly, not drawing attention. He simply walked through the crowd with the kind of quiet authority that made men step aside without quite realizing they had done so. He stopped at the edge of the wagon platform, reached into a leather pouch at his belt, and placed a single silver dollar on the weathered boards. The coin rang like a bell in sudden silence. "I will buy the contract," he said. His English was precise, each word carefully shaped. His voice carried no emotion whatsoever. Deputy George Kinley pushed forward, shotgun cradled in his arms, his face showing the particular exhaustion of a man who has seen too many bad things he could not prevent. "Now hold on, Swift Elk. The sale is legal." The Lakota man Rotag, though the townspeople called him Swift Elk when they called him anything, did not raise his voice. "A debt contract publicly offered with payment made before witnesses. The territorial code is clear on such transactions." George's jaw worked. He looked at Aldrich, at the crowd, at the silver dollar gleaming on the wagon bed. The law was a thin, unreliable thing out here, bent and shaped by whoever held the most guns or the most money. But it existed, and George tried to honor it, even when it made him feel like he was drowning. "Payments made," George said finally, the words tasting like ash. "Contract transfers legal to..." He hesitated. "To Rotag. Anyone disputes it, you file a claim with the territorial court in gold dust." Aldrich's face went purple. "Like hell it does. That's my..." He never finished the sentence. His shove caught Rotag in the chest, hard enough to send them both stumbling backward into the corral fence. On the other side, a 1,200-pound steer slammed its weight against already weakened boards. The fence shattered. Rotag twisted, grabbed Elise's wrist, and yanked her clear as a horn slashed through the space where her ribs had been. George's shotgun blast into the air scattered the animals and froze the crowd. In the ringing aftermath, Rotag cut the rope from Elise's wrists with a knife pulled from his boot. The blade was sharp enough that she barely felt it part the hemp, only the sudden absence of constriction. He walked away without looking back, and Elise followed because there was nothing else to do. Behind them, soldiers from the fort watched with their hands resting on rifle stocks, but no one fired. The transaction had been public legal witnessed. Murder would be harder to excuse. On the porch of the freight office, Conrad Voss lowered his cup of coffee and watched them go. He was a handsome man, gone slightly to seed with silver, threading his dark hair and lines around his mouth that spoke of smiles offered, but not felt. His business involved shipping cargo west, furniture, dry goods equipment. And women, though, that was never written in the ledgers he showed to territorial inspectors. He made a mental note of the Lakota scout, and the woman filed them away under minor complications and returned to his paperwork. He had no idea that his private ledger, the one that documented every woman, every price, every forged signature, was currently wrapped in oilcloth inside Elise's threadbare saddlebag. Some discoveries take time. This one would take 3 years. The homestead sat where the prairie began its long slope toward distant mountains, in a place where cottonwoods marked an underground creek that ran most of the year. 3 miles from Prairie Dawn. Far enough to avoid casual visitors. Close enough to reach town when necessary. The cabin was small, a single room with a loft for sleeping, built from rough-cut logs that still wept sap in summer heat. Someone had chinked the gaps with mud and prairie grass, but winters must have been brutal. A stone fireplace occupied one wall. The chimney drew poorly, filling the room with smoke on windy days. 3 children emerged from behind the cabin as Rotag and Elise approached. The oldest was a girl of perhaps 10, with watchful dark eyes and 2 neat braids that fell past her shoulders. 2 younger boys clung to her skirts, brothers from the similarity of their features, both in that gawky stage of childhood where they were all elbows and knees. "Nita Faladasan," Rotag said quietly. "This is Elise. She will be staying with us." The children stared. Elise stared back. She knew what they saw, a white woman thin as a rail with bruises yellowing on her jaw and hollow places under her eyes that came from hunger deliberately withheld as punishment. She did not know what she was supposed to say to children who were not hers, in a home that was not hers, attached to a man who had bought her debt for reasons she could not begin to fathom. Inside the cabin was surprisingly clean. Furs lined the walls for insulation. A low table held tin plates and cups. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, sage sweetgrass, something else she did not recognize. The air smelled of wood smoke and tanned leather, and very faintly of bread that had been baked days earlier. Rotag placed the indenture contract on the table and stepped back, leaving space between them. "You owe work according to this paper," he said. "You do not owe anything else. If you wish to leave, you may leave. If you stay, we will discuss terms." Elise looked at him. Really looked for the first time since the market. He was perhaps 30, with a weathered face that showed both laugh lines and scars. His hands, resting loosely at his sides, bore the calluses of someone who worked constantly with rope and tools and weapons. He wore buckskin trousers and a linen shirt that had been mended multiple times with careful, even stitches. His eyes were the color of flint, and they watched her with the same careful neutrality she had seen in animals that had been beaten but not broken, waiting to see if this new human would bring pain or something else. "If Aldrich comes with men," Elise said slowly, tasting each word, "he will claim I am his wife, not his indentured servant. A piece of paper will not save either of us then." "No," Rotag agreed. "It will not. So why did you buy the contract?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking not at her, but past her toward something she could not see. "Because I watched someone die once while good people did nothing. I am trying not to be one of those people anymore." It was not the answer she expected. It was also, she sensed, the only answer he would give. That night, after a meal of cornmeal, mush, and venison, so tough, it required patient chewing, Elise learned the children's stories. Nita's parents had been killed in a winter raid 3 years earlier, soldiers burning lodges, shooting anyone who ran. She had survived by crawling into a snowbank and staying there perfectly still, perfectly silent, while her world burned. Fala and Dasan had been found near a wagon trail left behind during a forced march, when their mother could no longer carry them both. Rotag had taken them in, fed them, taught them to survive in a world that had no interest in their survival. "Where is your wife?" Elise asked, because the cabin showed signs of a woman's touch, and the herbs, the mended clothes, the careful organization. Rotag's face went still, went dead. Smallpox 3 years back. The fort doctor would not open the gates. I held her while she died 20 feet from help that never came. "Your child?" "With her." The words fell between them like stones, dropping into deep water, disappearing into darkness. Later, when the children slept in the loft and the fire burned low, Elise spoke into the dimness. "I have something I need to tell you." She retrieved the oilcloth package from her bag, unwrapped it, and showed Rotag the ledger. His face did not change as she explained what it was, what it documented, where she had taken it from. "Conrad Voss will come looking for this eventually," Rotag said finally. "When he does, he will bring guns." "I know. You should have burned it, taken the knowledge and let the evidence disappear." "I thought about that." Elise's hands trembled slightly as she rewrapped the book. "But I kept seeing the names, all those women. If I burn this, there is no proof it ever happened. Conrad continues his business, and women keep disappearing into wagons going west. And if you keep it, everyone in this house becomes a target." "Yes." Rotag studied her for a long moment. Then he took the ledger, crossed to the corner of the cabin, and pried up a loose floorboard. Beneath was a hollow space lined with oiled canvas. He placed the ledger inside and replaced the board. Then we keep it until we are strong enough to use it, he said, and we prepare for what comes after. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Rotag hunted and traded, ranging farther into the territory than Elise thought safe. She cooked, mended, managed the small vegetable plot, and began teaching the children their letters using a battered copy of Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac she found in a trunk beneath the bed. They spoke to each other carefully, like diplomats negotiating a truce in a language neither fully commanded. But they worked well together. She anticipated what needed doing. He noticed when she struggled with heavy tasks and adjusted the work without comment or condescension. And slowly, in those early autumn weeks, they began to build something that resembled trust. The crisis arrived on a morning in late November, when ice crusted the water bucket and breath misted white in the air. Elise was drawing water from the well when the rope gave way, not frayed cut. She saw the clean slice as it whipped past her face, saw the bucket plunge into darkness and strike stone 20 feet below, with a crack that echoed like a broken bone. She stood staring at the severed rope in her hands, at the cleanness of the cut, and felt her stomach drop away. Rotag appeared at her elbow, examined the rope in silence, and then looked toward the trail leading to town. Boot prints. 2 horses. Recent enough that the frost had not fully settled into the depressions. They were here last night, he said quietly, watching. The bucket had been their only reliable vessel for drawing water. Without it, they would have to lower someone into the well, a dangerous task in a shaft lined with loose stone, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. I will go, Rotag said. You are too broad. If the walls shift, then I will die quickly and you will take the children to Dr. Charles in town. His voice was matter-of-fact. You are needed to keep them alive after. I am expendable. That is not... Elise stopped, swallowed the protest. They both knew it was true. She had seen how the townspeople looked at him. If Rotag died, there would be minimal investigation. If she died, there might be questions. She tied their strongest rope around his chest, in a harness knot her father had taught her on Mississippi riverboats a lifetime ago. The children, all 3 of them pale and silent, braced themselves at the well's edge. Nita held the rope with both hands, her face set in lines too old for her years. Rotag descended into darkness, hand over hand, boots scraping for purchase on stone walls that crumbled at the slightest pressure. Elise played out rope, feeling every shift of weight, every pause that might mean disaster. Pebbles rained down from above. The walls groaned. At the bottom, working mostly by touch in the dimness, Rotag salvaged pieces of the broken bucket and tied them together with the severed rope. 2 tugs on the line. Elise and the children hauled, muscles burning until the makeshift bundle cleared the edge. Then they pulled again, bringing Rotag up foot by agonizing foot, while loose earth continued to shower down. When he finally climbed out, his knuckles were bleeding, and a cut above his eye dripped steadily. He sat on the frozen ground for a moment, breathing hard, then looked at Elise. Someone wants us to know we are being watched. Conrad or Aldrich? Does it matter? He stood testing his weight. They are telling us to be afraid. I am afraid. The admission came out flat honest. I have been afraid every day since New Orleans, but fear has not killed me yet. Something shifted in Rotag's expression, not quite a smile, but a recognition of kinship. They were both people who had learned to function with terror as a constant companion. That night, he taught her to load and fire his rifle. Her first shot went wide, the recoil nearly knocking her backward. Her second shot hit the fence post they had been aiming at dead center. The third shot splintered the post in half. You have done this before, Rotag observed. My father took me hunting when I was young, before he died. Elise worked the rifle's action, checking the mechanism. I had forgotten I knew how. Over the following weeks, they fortified the homestead. Rotag excavated a dugout shelter near the creek, concealed beneath brush and accessible through a camouflaged entrance. They cached supplies, dried venison, cornmeal, blankets, ammunition in sealed containers buried at intervals only they knew. He taught all 3 children to throw stones with accuracy, making it into contests that had them laughing and competing, while learning skills that might save their lives. "Why stones?" Dasan asked one afternoon, having just struck a fence post from 30 paces. "Because you cannot always carry a gun," Rotag said. "But stones are everywhere. Learn to use what you have." In December, Dr. Charles Whitcomb made his first visit to the homestead. He was a lean man in his 50s, with the careful hands of someone who had set bones and dug out bullets and stitched wounds in conditions that made failure likely and success a small miracle. He brought quinine for winter fevers and a standing invitation. "If you need help, you come find me," he told Rotag. "I owe you that much." "You owe me nothing." "Then let me say I owe myself the chance to do better than I did before." Charles looked at the children, at Elise, trying to stay out of sight in the cabin, at the careful preparations visible to someone who knew what to look for. "You're expecting trouble. Trouble is already here. We are simply waiting for it to announce itself." Through Charles, they carefully, quietly built a network of allies. Hugo Reinhardt, a German farmer, whose cousin had answered an advertisement for a Western bride and never been heard from again. Mrs. Talbot, who ran the boarding house and whose husband had died under suspicious circumstances after threatening to expose Conrad's business practices. A freed black family named Washington, who understood exactly how fragile safety could be. A pair of Norwegian brothers who had learned the hard way that the frontier respected competence more than origin, but only barely. These were not people who made grand gestures. They were survivors who recognized other survivors and understood that solidarity was a form of armor. In March, Rotag and Elise made a supply run to Wildflower, 10 miles east. Spring melt had swollen the creek into a river that moved with the sound of grinding stones and carried whole trees in its current. The ford was passable, but barely. Rotag urged the mules forward, and for the first 30 feet, all went well. Then a wheel struck a submerged boulder and jammed. The wagon listed hard. Current slammed against the broadside, pushing them toward deeper water. Elise climbed down, without being asked, the icy water taking her breath, and wedged a pry bar under the wheel. She was not strong enough to move it alone. Rotag joined her, and together they heaved until the wheel lurched free. The sudden release sent Elise stumbling. Her boots slipped on smooth riverstone. The current took her. She went under the world, turning into brown chaos and cold that went beyond pain, into something that felt like her body was being dismantled piece by piece. Her skirts wrapped around her legs, binding, dragging. She could not tell which direction was air. Then her shoulder struck rock. She grabbed it with both hands, nails breaking on stone, and held on while the river tried to tear her loose. Rotag's rope landed across her back. She grabbed it one-handed, unable to release the rock with both hands, without being swept away. He hauled from the bank, feet braced, and she made inches of progress, as then more. Her ribs scraped across the rock, hard enough to drive blood through her dress. On the bank, they collapsed side by side, shaking so hard their teeth rattled. The furs in the wagon were soaked, a winter's worth of work ruined. But they were alive. Elise began to laugh, a thin sound that was half sob. That was stupid. That was necessary. Rotag was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. You did not hesitate. Neither did you. They sat there in the mud until the shaking subsided And when they finally stood, something between them had changed. Not love, not yet. But the recognition that they would risk themselves for each other had been tested and proven true. That night, camped on the far bank, they talked quietly while the fire burned low. "I was married before," Elise said. "Briefly. Yellow fever took him 8 months after the wedding. I thought—" She paused, choosing words. "I thought I was cursed, that everything I touched would die. When Aldrich said I was barren, it felt like proof." Rotag was silent for a long moment. "My wife sang every night. Traditional songs. Even when our son was too young to understand, she sang. The night they died, I heard her singing outside the fort walls, trying to comfort him. I have not been able to hear singing since without—" He stopped. "Some losses leave marks that never heal. We carry them anyway." Elise reached out slowly, giving him time to withdraw, and placed her hand over his. He did not pull away. The riders came in late January, when ice fog turned the world into a white void, where sound traveled strangely and direction became a guess. Elise saw them first, 2 shapes emerging from the fog, like ghosts solidifying into flesh. She recognized one, the scarred man from Conrad's freight company, who had been present when she signed her original contract, who had smiled while explaining exactly what would happen if she tried to run. She moved without thinking, gathering the children and herding them toward the trapdoor Rotag had excavated for exactly this purpose. "Not a sound," she whispered. "Not a breath." Rotag met the riders 20 paces from the cabin, rifle held ready. "What do you want?" The scarred man grinned. "Just checking on Mr. Boone's property, making sure she is being treated proper. The contract transferred legally. You have no claim here." "Well, now that is a matter of interpretation." The man's companion, younger and nervous, pulled out a cigarette. He struck a lucifer, lit it, then flicked the burning match toward the cabin. It landed in dry grass near the foundation. A thin line of smoke began to curl upward. Elise appeared with the water bucket, her face arranged in an expression of housewifely annoyance. She dumped water on the ember, then stomped it for good measure, grinding her heel down with far more force than necessary. When she looked up, her eyes met the scarred man's gaze without flinching. "Clumsy," she said mildly. "You should be more careful." The man's grin widened. "You have got spirit. I remember that from the contract signing. You tried to read the fine print. Most of them do not even try. Most of them trust that men are honest. And you did not. I trusted that men are exactly what they show themselves to be. You showed me enough." The riders left eventually, but the message was clear. They knew where the homestead was, knew the family's vulnerabilities, and could return whenever they chose. That night, after the children were asleep, Elise and Rotag sat by the fire and argued in whispers. "You should take the ledger and go," Rotag said. "East or north into Dakota territory. Somewhere Conrad's reach does not extend. You could start over. And leave you and the children to face whatever comes." Elise shook her head. "No. They will come whether I am here or not. At least, if I stay, we face them together. You do not know what you are asking. When Conrad comes, and he will come, it will not be a legal matter. It will be men with guns, probably at night, probably with fire. I have seen how these things end. So have I." Elise leaned forward, her voice hard. "I know exactly what I am choosing. Do not make the mistake of thinking I am naive about violence just because I am a woman. I survived 2 years with Aldrich. I know what men are capable of when they believe no one will stop them. Then what do you propose? We build. We find more allies. Dr. Charles Hugo, Mrs. Talbot, there are good people in Prairie Dawn who are just as tired of Conrad's business as we are. We make ourselves strong enough that when the fight comes, we do not face it alone. Rotag studied her for a long moment. You are different than you were. I am becoming who I was before fear taught me to make myself small. He nodded slowly. Then we build. But I teach you to fight first. Really fight, not just target practice. If men come in the night, you need to know how to kill them. Over the following months, they prepared. Rotag taught Elise not just to shoot, but to reload in darkness, to fight with a knife, to use her size as an advantage rather than a weakness. She taught the children to read and cipher, to understand land deeds and contracts, so that no one could cheat them with words they could not parse. Together, they turned the homestead into something that could be defended, and themselves into people capable of defending it. And slowly, carefully, they recruited. Dr. Charles became a regular visitor, bringing news and supplies, and a promise that when the time came, he would stand witness to whatever needed witnessing. Hugo brought tools and his own quiet determination. Mrs. Talbot brought information, who was meeting with Conrad, what was being planned, and the small details that meant the difference between surprise and preparation. By the time spring arrived, they were as ready as they could be for a fight they knew was coming, but could not predict. The pregnancy was discovered by accident. Dr. Charles had come to check on Nita, who had developed a persistent cough that worried Rotag. While he was there, Elise mentioned feeling tired, occasionally nauseous, and Charles asked a few careful questions before examining her with professional thoroughness. "You are with child," he said finally. "About 3 months along, I would judge." Elise stared at him. The words made no sense. They contradicted 2 years of being told repeatedly and viciously that her body was broken, useless, incapable of the one function that gave a woman value in this world. That cannot be right. It is right. Charles's voice gentled. "Elise, some men are incapable of fathering children and blame their wives rather than admit their own inadequacy. Aldrich was almost certainly one of those men. You were never the problem." When she told Rotag that evening after the children had gone to bed, he was quiet for so long she thought he had not heard. Then he reached out and placed his hand on her stomach, palm flat, and said in Lakota something she did not understand, but felt in her bones was a prayer or a promise, or both. "I will not let anything happen to you," he said in English, "or to this child. Whatever comes, we face it together." The first birth came in February 1857, during a blizzard that made travel impossible. Dr. Charles could not reach them. Elise labored for 18 hours while Rotag held her hand, and Nita at 14 proved herself capable of assisting with a midwifery that would have broken most grown women. A son healthy and squalling. They named him Washta Good. The second pregnancy was easier, resulting in a daughter born in autumn 1858. But the third, in July 1859, nearly killed her. The bleeding started before the child was even born and did not stop after. Rotag rode through heat that shimmered like water on the horizon, his horse nearly breaking its neck in a prairie dog hole, to bring Charles back in time to stitch torn vessels and save Elise's life with instruments boiled over a fire and hands that had steadied themselves through sheer force of will. "No more," Charles told Rotag bluntly. "Her body cannot survive another pregnancy so soon. You must give her time to heal. Years, not months." But Elise was not done building a family. When an orphan train rattled into Prairie Dawn in spring 1857, she stood on the platform and read the cards pinned to small coats. Most families wanted young children, preferably white, preferably without complications. The mixed heritage siblings, Mary and Thomas, ages 6 and 4, with a Cheyenne father and white mother who had died of cholera, stood at the end of the line, already learning not to hope. "Those two," Elise said to the agent, We will take them. Ma'am, I should tell you their daddy was. I know who their father was. We will take them. With Nita Fala Dasan, her own 3 biological children, and Mary and Thomas, the cabin overflowed with life. 7 children in total, ranging from infant to teenager, all calling Rotag father and Elise mother, in a linguistic blend that shifted between Lakota and English mid-sentence. Through those years, the threat of Conrad remained constant, but distant, a storm visible on the horizon, but not yet arrived. They knew he was looking for the ledger. They knew he would eventually put the pieces together. But months passed then, a year then too, and the false peace began to feel almost real. Until October 1858, when everything broke open. Prairie dawn transformed during cattle drive season. Drovers flooded the town with money and boredom, a volatile combination that regularly resulted in property damage, injuries, and the occasional killing. George Kinley did his best to maintain order, but one deputy could only do so much when faced with 100 men who had been on the trail for months. Rotag brought Washta into town to trade furs for winter supplies, leaving Elise and the other children at home. It was a calculated risk. Being visible in town created vulnerability, but isolating themselves completely created suspicion. They walked a narrow line between the 2 dangers. The incident began with a spooked horse. Someone set off a firecracker, drunk and stupid probably rather than malicious, and a rider's mount bolted straight down Main Street. A child froze in its path, too frightened to move. Rotag moved without thinking, catching the trailing reins and yanking hard enough to redirect the animal. The horse's shoulder caught him, spinning him around, but the child was safe. The crowd erupted in cheers. For one brief shining moment, Rotag was not Swift Elk, the tolerated savage. He was a hero. People clapped him on the back, pressed drinks into his hands, treated him like he belonged. Conrad Voss, watching from the saloon, recognized his opportunity. He moved through the crowd like a snake through tall grass, quiet and deliberate. His words were carefully chosen, calibrated to inflame existing prejudices while maintaining plausible deniability. A white woman living with a savage. Children being raised in degradation. Good land wasted on someone who had no legal right to claim it. Each statement built on the last, constructing a narrative that felt true because it confirmed what people already wanted to believe. The mob formed with terrifying speed. 20 men became 30, became 50, fueled by whiskey, and the particular righteousness that comes from having permission to commit violence in service of an idea. They grabbed Rotag outside the general store. He fought, but numbers overwhelmed him. They bound his hands with rope that cut deep enough to draw blood and dragged him toward a telegraph pole at the edge of town. George Kinley tried to intervene, shouting about law and process in courts, but the mob ignored him. Someone shoved him hard enough to knock him down, and by the time he regained his feet, they had Rotag on a barrel with a noose around his neck. Washta stood frozen in the crowd, watching his father about to die, until Hugo grabbed him and held him back from rushing forward. "Papa." The boy's voice cracked, caught between childhood and something older. Rotag looked at his son. "Protect your mother and the others," he said in Lakota, his voice steady despite the rope. "You know what to do." At that moment, Elise pushed through the mob with her youngest child in her arms, and the older children clinging to her skirts. How she had known to come, no one could say. Perhaps word had traveled, or perhaps she had simply felt it in her bones. She fought through the crowd with the desperation of someone who had already lost too much and would not lose this. Instead of begging, she did something no one expected. She climbed onto the water trough, stood tall despite her fear, and pulled a small leather-bound book from beneath her shawl. When she spoke, her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "His name is Conrad Voss. This is his ledger. Everything he has done is written here, every woman he has trafficked, every forged document, every illegal sale. You want to hang someone? Start with the man who sells human beings and calls it business. She opened the book and began reading names, dates, prices, real names, real women. Some of the men in the crowd recognized sisters, cousins, neighbors who had disappeared after answering advertisements for Western brides. Dr. Charles pushed forward with copied pages, offering corroboration. I treated many of these women. Mary O'Connell, broken ribs, dislocated shoulder burns, consistent with deliberate torture. She told me her husband had purchased her from Conrad Voss. Catherine Brennan attempted suicide in my office after describing how she was sold to a man 3 times her age. This is not marriage. This is slavery with paperwork. The mob wavered. Some men stepped back uncertain. Others began to look at Conrad with dawning horror or rage. George cut the noose, dropping Rotag hard to his knees. Conrad lunged for Elise, clearly intending to destroy the evidence and silence her permanently. Rotag, still bound and gasping, threw himself between them. Conrad's fist connected with his jaw, snapping his head sideways. "You think this matters?" Conrad's voice was low, venomous. "You think anyone will believe a savage and a whore over me? I have lawyers, money, connections that reach all the way to the territorial governor. You have nothing." "We have the truth," Elise said steadily, "and the truth has a way of spreading." Conrad looked around and saw his carefully constructed narrative crumbling. The mob was no longer unified. Some men were backing away, wanting no part of what was clearly a more complicated situation than they had been told. Others were turning on Conrad, recognizing their own complicity, or simply seizing an opportunity to tear down someone who had gotten too wealthy, too comfortable, too confident. George and Hugo grabbed Conrad's arms and hauled him toward the jail. He fought, still spitting threats, still certain his money would save him. He was wrong. But it would take time and one crucial mistake before justice could fully run its course. Conrad Voss was locked in Prairie Dawn's small jail to await transport to Gold Dust for trial. The evidence was damning. The ledger corroborated testimony from multiple women, Dr. Charles's medical records documenting abuse. The territorial prosecutor was already preparing a case that would at minimum result in asset seizure and imprisonment. But Conrad had built his empire on understanding how systems worked and where they could be compromised. He had money hidden in accounts under false names. He had debtors who owed him favors. And he had, most critically, a jailer named Pete Cullens, who had gambling debts that exceeded 3 years' salary. The escape happened on the night before Conrad was scheduled to be transferred. Pete claimed later, and no one fully believed him, that he had been hit from behind while checking on the prisoner. When George arrived at dawn to escort Conrad to the transport wagon, he found Pete unconscious, with a suspiciously light bruise, and Conrad gone. George sent riders in all directions, but Conrad had hours of darkness and intimate knowledge of every trail and hiding spot within 50 miles. More importantly, he had nothing left to lose. His business was destroyed, his reputation shattered, his assets frozen. The only thing he could still control was revenge. He gathered men carefully over the following weeks, not employees anymore, but mercenaries. Drifters wanted for crimes in other territories. Former Confederate soldiers still fighting their own private war. Men who killed for pay and asked no questions. He promised them Rotag's land, Elise's silence, and money from a cache no one knew about. The homestead entered a period of watchful dread. They knew Conrad was out there. They knew he would come. They simply did not know when or how. Rotag's neck never fully healed from the near hanging. Cold weather brought pain that radiated from shoulder to jaw, and his right hand developed a tremor that made long rifle shots nearly impossible. He learned to compensate, switching to his left hand for precision work, but the injury was a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Elise carried her own damage from the difficult birth and from Conrad's final attempt to take the ledger by force. Her ribs had been cracked, poorly set, and now ached with every deep breath. Lifting anything heavy brought waves of pain that made her dizzy. They adapted. The older children took on more responsibility. Nita, at 18, could manage the household as well as Elise. Washta, at 11, could track and hunt with a competence that belied his age. In February, someone poisoned their well. They discovered it when one of the horses became violently ill after drinking. Rotag had to dig a new well 30 yards away, breaking through frozen ground with pickaxe and determination, while they hauled water from the creek and prayed it would not freeze solid before the new well was complete. In March, fire took the barn. They saved the house only because Fala woke to use the privy and saw the first flames. The family formed a bucket line and fought until dawn, their hands blistered and lungs seared to keep the fire from spreading. In the ashes, they found a whiskey bottle with Conrad's Freight Company brand. Stamped into the glass, a signature, a taunt, a promise. Dr. Charles urged them to abandon the homestead and move into town where they could be protected. Rotag refused. This land was more than property. It was proof that a Lakota man could claim space in a white world and have that claim recognized. To leave would be to concede that he existed only by sufferance, not by right. April brought false spring days warm enough to melt snow nights, cold enough to freeze it again. The trail to town became a morass of mud that could swallow a wheel to the axle. They were isolated, vulnerable, and they knew Conrad was simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The moment came on April 28, 1859, just after dawn. Rotag, Washta, and Dasan left at first light to check the fish traps and hunt for early spring rabbits. Standard practice, they had done it dozens of times. But this morning, Conrad had stationed a man on the trail with a rifle and instructions to delay, but not kill. Just slow them down long enough. The first shot came from a copse of cottonwood striking the ground 2 feet from Rotag's horse. The animal reared. Rotag controlled it, reached for his rifle, and a second shot grazed his thigh, not deep but enough to draw blood and burn like a brand. He fell from the saddle, dragged himself behind a fallen log, and returned fire while Washta used a piece of mirror to flash sunlight and confuse the shooter's aim. Dasan, small and clever, circled wide through a washout and spooked the ambusher's horse with a well-thrown rock. When the man broke cover to catch his mount, Rotag's bullet took him through the shoulder, disabling, not lethal. They bound the man with his own belt, and rope left him where he would not bleed out, and rode hard for home. At the homestead, Conrad and 4 riders had already struck. The attack was not subtle. Gunfire shattered windows and chewed splinters from the doorframe. Elise shoved the 5 younger children toward the hidden root cellar, grabbed the shotgun Rotag kept loaded, and made it halfway to the door before Conrad slammed through. He was faster than she expected, stronger, and absolutely certain of his superiority. The pistol butt caught her ribs with enough force to crack bone. She fell, knocking over a lamp. Oil spread across the floor, caught fire. She kicked the burning lamp away from the curtains and bed while Conrad stood over her with his pistol aimed at her head. "You should have burned the ledger," he said conversationally. "Should have taken the hint when we cut your well rope. Should have left with your children when you had the chance. But you had to be righteous." Aldrich grabbed Fala, dragging the boy toward the door despite his kicks and screams. Another rider took Thomas, hoisting him by the back of his shirt. The child was crying, terrified, calling for his mother. Conrad hauled Elise to her feet with brutal efficiency. "Here is what happens now. Your savage comes to the old silver mine before sunset alone and unarmed. He walks in, and I let you and the children walk out. Simple exchange. He does not come, or he comes with help, and I start with the smallest child and work my way up. Do you understand?" Elise understood. She nodded. "Good girl. See, you can be reasonable when properly motivated." They took her and the 2 boys in a wagon and were gone, before Nita emerged from hiding to send Dasan racing toward the creek to find Rotag. By the time Rotag reached the homestead, his thigh was wrapped in blood-soaked cloth, and every step sent pain shooting through his leg. He read Conrad's message carved into the door, Old Silver Mine, sunset, alone, and knew immediately it was a trap. Conrad would not simply release hostages. He would kill everyone and claim it was justice for crimes that existed only in his imagination. But Elise and the children were in that mine, and walking into a trap was better than doing nothing. He sent Washta to town for help, though he knew George and Dr. Charles could not arrive in time to matter. Then he gathered weapons, checked his ammunition, and prepared to trade his life for whatever slim chance his family had at survival. The mine was exactly as he remembered, abandoned for a decade, slowly collapsing, a death trap, even before men with guns made it worse. Rusted ore carts, rotten timbers, the entrance yawning like a mouth ready to swallow. A mob was already forming at the base of the hill, 24 men at least, drawn by Conrad's lies. He had ridden through town, spreading the story Rotag had killed one of his men, kidnapped a white woman and children, and was holed up in the mine like a rabid animal. Half the men probably believed it. The other half just wanted entertainment. Dr. Charles and George arrived with Hugo, Mrs. Talbot, and a few others, placing themselves between the mob and the mine entrance. Charles held up ledger pages shouting the truth about Conrad's trade in women, but his voice was drowned by angry shouts and the particular bloodlust that comes from having permission to commit violence. Inside the mine, Elise pushed the children deeper into darkness, away from the entrance. She found old timbers and used them to shore up sagging supports that looked ready to collapse at any moment. Dust trickled constantly from above. The air was stale, thick with the smell of rot and mineral damp. "Miss Elise, I am scared," Thomas whispered, his small hand clutching her skirt. "I know, sweetheart, but remember what your father taught you about being brave when you are scared." She crouched to his level, ignoring the pain in her ribs. "He is coming for us. And when he comes, we are going to walk out of here together." Outside, Conrad emerged from behind an ore cart with a canvas-wrapped bundle of blasting powder in one hand and a lit match in the other. His positioning was deliberate. He stood on a slight rise with clear sight lines in all directions, with large rocks at his back, providing cover. From where he stood, he could see anyone approaching from town, and the angle made a clear shot nearly impossible without exposing the shooter to return fire. "Swift Elk," he called. "You have 10 seconds to come out unarmed, or I seal this mine with everyone inside it." Rotag stepped into view, limping badly, hands visibly empty. His rifle was slung across his back. "Let them go first." "No, you do not make terms. You are going to die here today, and your woman is going to watch, and then she is going to spend the rest of her short life wishing she had kept her mouth shut." Conrad's smile was terrible calm, satisfied, certain of victory. "You never should have touched what was mine." "She was never yours. She is a person, not property." "Property, person out here, what is the difference?" Conrad touched the match to the powder fuse. It sputtered, sparked, began its steady burn toward detonation. Rotag knew his wounded leg would not let him close the distance before the fuse burned down. He knew the angle was wrong. For a clean shot, Conrad had positioned himself too well. He dropped to one knee, brought his rifle around with his left hand. But the shot was nearly impossible, and even if it landed, the falling powder charge would still explode at the tunnel entrance. It was a perfect trap. Conrad had thought of everything. Everything except a 12-year-old boy who had spent years learning to throw stones with deadly accuracy. Dasan had circled wide during the confrontation, moving with the patience Rotag had drilled into all the children. He understood instinctively what Rotag could not do from his angle. He picked up a stone the size of a goose egg calculated distance, and windaged the way he had practiced 1,000 times, and threw with every ounce of strength in his young body. The stone struck Conrad's wrist just as he adjusted his grip on the burning powder charge. Bone cracked audibly, his hand spasmed, fingers going nerveless. The powder charge tumbled from his grip and rolled directly toward the rotted support beams at the mine entrance, exactly where it would do maximum damage. Down! Rotag threw himself behind a boulder, dragging Washta with him. Cover your head. The explosion was not heard so much as felt a physical blow that traveled through earth and bone, that stopped hearts for a beat and left ears ringing in a silence that felt like death. The mine entrance collapsed in a roar of falling rock and splintering timber. Dust billowed outward in a choking cloud that turned day into twilight. When the dust began to settle, the mob stood in shocked silence. The tunnel entrance was gone, buried under tons of rock. If anyone was alive inside, they were entombed. Conrad tried to run, cradling his shattered wrist. He made it perhaps 10 steps before Hugo and 2 other men tackled him and held him down while he screamed curses and threats that no longer mattered to anyone. Rotag staggered to his feet, looked at the collapsed entrance, and felt something cold and hollow open in his chest. Then he turned to the stunned mob and spoke in a voice like iron. Every man here takes a shovel to pick your bare hands. Those are children inside. My children. Innocent children. If you have any humanity left, you move. Now. For a moment, no one moved. Then a drover dropped his rifle and grabbed a shovel. Then another. Then 5 more. The mob transformed into a rescue party with the suddenness of revelation. Inside the collapsed tunnel, Elise kept the children alive. Through the simplest means, she kept them busy and gave them hope. Fala, count these rocks as I stack them. Thomas, tell me all the colors you can see. Slowly, one at a time. She used a rusted ore bar to prop up a beam that was visibly sagging her arms, shaking with effort, hands bleeding, muscles screaming. If that beam failed, the entire ceiling would come down. So she held it because holding it was the only option that did not end with her children buried in darkness. Overhead picks and shovels rang against stone. The sound grew louder, closer. Guided by Elise's shouts about where the tunnel curved, Rotag and the crew dug with desperate efficiency. His hands blistered, bled into the dirt until he could not distinguish his blood from the earth. When his leg buckled and he nearly collapsed, Washta stepped in without being asked. Rest, Papa. I can do this. Rotag shifted to hauling rocks, limping with each step, driven by a terror so pure it felt like clarity. Hours passed. The sun touched the horizon. And finally, a pick broke through. Air rushed into the stale darkness. A child's hand appeared through the gap, small and dirt-covered and alive. They widened the opening, pulled Thomas out first, then Fala, then finally reached in for Elise. Rotag's hand found hers in the darkness. Their fingers interlaced and held, and he pulled her through into dying sunlight. Behind them, with a sound like a vast exhalation, the tunnel's ceiling collapsed exactly where they had been standing. Rotag wrapped his arms around Elise, and she buried her face against his chest, both of them shaking so hard they could barely stand. And then Conrad, despite his shattered wrist, despite being surrounded, pulled a knife from an inattentive guard's belt with his left hand and lunged toward Rotag's unprotected back, aiming for the kidney. Father! Washta's scream came too late to prevent the attacks, only to warn. Rotag started to turn too slow. A second stone, thrown with the same deadly accuracy as the first, struck Conrad's knife hand, hard enough to break bone and send the blade spinning away harmlessly. George Kinley moved faster than his age suggested possible, slamming Conrad face first into the dirt and pressing a knee into his spine. "You are done," he said quietly. "No more second chances." No more bought judges. You are done. The mob, watching a man try to stab an unarmed father in front of his children, finally understood completely who the monster was. Conrad Voss was transported to Gold Dust in chains and placed in a cell under guard by federal marshals, not local law. The charges expanded to include attempted murder, kidnapping, and selling women across territorial lines, arson, and a dozen other counts. His assets were seized under territorial law. His lawyer, discovering that defending Conrad would destroy his own reputation, quietly withdrew. The trial lasted 3 days. Elise testified, first reading from the ledger in a steady voice that never wavered. Dr. Charles presented medical records documenting systematic abuse of multiple women. Hugo brought letters from his cousin describing how she had been sold to a rancher who worked her like livestock. Mrs. Talbot described threats Conrad had made against her late husband. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. Conrad was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison with all assets forfeit. The judge did something unusual. He designated a portion of the seized land and funds as a trust for widows, orphans, and mixed heritage families to be administered by a board, including Dr. Charles, Mrs. Talbot, and 2 others with unimpeachable reputations. It was not enough. It could never be enough to undo the damage Conrad had done. But it was something. A small piece of justice carved from stone. Aldrich Boone, facing charges as an accomplice, took his own way out with a rifle in a stable behind the jail. No one mourned him. Rotag and Elise's union remained technically illegal under territorial anti-miscegenation statutes, but common law marriage was recognized for property purposes. The homestead was registered in both their names. All 7 children were listed as legal heirs with equal shares. The injuries they carried would never fully heal. Rotag's leg ached in cold weather, and his right hand trembled too much for precision work. Elise's ribs gave her constant low pain that flared into agony with deep breaths or heavy lifting. They adapted divided labor, differently accepted limitations without shame. Other families began settling nearby Lakota families, who saw that success was possible, settler families who were willing to live without prejudice. Not many. Enough. A small community began to form, bound by mutual protection and shared work. It was not acceptance, but it was coexistence. And that was a beginning. 8 years after Rotag paid $1 silver for a woman called Barren, the homestead had grown into something neither of them could have imagined in that initial moment of transaction. A proper house stood where the cramped cabin had been, 2 stories, glass windows, a stone chimney that drew smoke efficiently. Under the cottonwood laundry lines held clothes of every size, testimony to a family that had grown not by accident, but by deliberate choice. 7 children played in the yard, ages ranging from 15 down to 2, and their voices weaving between Lakota and English, with the unconscious fluency of children who belonged fully to both worlds and therefore to neither, creating something new. On land that had once been Conrad's, a schoolhouse was being completed. The sign above the door read, "Prairie Dawn Community School, all welcome." The deed signing ceremony was small. Dr. Charles hammered the last board while Hugo and the Washington brothers set fence posts. Mrs. Talbot brought food. George Kinley watched with quiet satisfaction, his shotgun propped against the wall. More from habit than necessity. When the territorial clerk produced the paperwork, he hesitated at the line requiring Rotag's legal name. The form assumed a structure surname Christian name that did not account for the man standing before him. Rotag took the pen. He signed in clear, deliberate letters, Rotag Moreau. The clerk blinked. "You are taking her surname, sir." "I am creating our surname." Rotag's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath. "So that when my children stand in a courtroom or a land office, or any place where their right to exist is questioned, They can present papers that say they belong to both worlds by law and by blood and by choice. No one will be able to tell them they are less than whole. The clerk looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and stamped the document with the territorial seal. Rotag Moreau it is then. As evening settled over the prairie, Rotag and Elise stood on their porch and watched the children play. Nita sang softly while braiding little Ruth's hair, one of the old songs Rotag's first wife had sung, preserved and passed on because beautiful things deserve to survive tragedy. Washta and Dasan were building something from scrap lumber, arguing cheerfully about engineering. The youngest children chased fireflies appearing in the gathering dusk. Inside the table was set for 12. There was always room for one more. Elise rested her head on Rotag's shoulder, careful of his painful right side. He wrapped his good arm around her waist with the ease of years of practice. "They told me I was barren," Elise said quietly. "Worthless. Not worth the price of the contract. They were wrong about everything." Rotag's voice was rough with emotion. "But they were right about one thing." "What?" "You were worth far more than $1. You were worth everything we built, everything we became." She smiled. "We were worth it. Both of us. All of us." The wind carried children's laughter, the smell of prairie grass and wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance, the call of geese flying their ancient paths. Through the windows, lamplight spilled out into darkness, a beacon visible for miles, announcing that people lived here, loved here, had carved out space to exist against all odds and expectations. The woman who had calculated the distance to her own death on an auction wagon 8 years earlier had in that time given Rotag not just 7 children, but proof that family was defined by choice and commitment tested in fire. The Lakota warrior, who had walked alone through a world that wanted him erased, now moved through evening with a wife beside him, children in his footsteps, and justice small, imperfect but real, carved from unforgiving land. It was not a fairy tale. The scars remained. The world outside their small community was still hostile, still dangerous, still waiting for them to fail. Tomorrow would bring more work, more struggle, more proof required of their right to simply exist. But tonight, in this moment, they had won. Not permanently, not completely, but enough. And sometimes in a world as brutal as this, their one enough was everything.